It's now time for our second keynote speaker, and I'd like to welcome Diane Jones-Allen to the stage. Good morning, Diane.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's so good to have you here. And I'm going to just jump right in because we've got a couple of questions so folks get a chance to get to know a little bit about you and your work, and then we'll jump into your keynote. To start off with, I'd love to hear a little bit from you on your personal relationship with nature and whether or not that relationship has changed in light of the pandemic.
So I grew up in the city of Baltimore. So I was an inner city kid, but my father, we had a really big garden in our yard. We lived in a row house, but we lived on the end. So we had a huge yard. And my father used to always take me fishing and hiking. I was a Girl Scout. And that's why going into landscape architecture just seemed like a natural thing for me. I love nature. I was just fishing on Saturday, me, my husband, and my son. And so it's just really important. It's important to my work and my mental health, especially now. We've been hiking actually more this summer because of COVID. So nature and parks. And I'm really lucky because I live in two places, really. I live in New Orleans and I live in Arlington, Texas. And the nature access is kind of different in New Orleans. You know, I walk along the levee and, you know, we go to the bayou or to, the river. And in Texas, they have a lot of built parks, which is really nice. There's a park right across. So the city of Arlington, where I live, which is in DFW, there are a lot of public park spaces, and they have a really active Trust for Public Land in Dallas, working on the 10-minute walk from every neighborhood. So I'm really lucky here because I have a lot of built park spaces, and I'm really lucky in New Orleans because there's this natural nature everywhere, nature growing off of your house, if you don't take care of it. So.
Right. Well, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but maybe you could share a little bit about, you've shared a little bit about your formative years. Maybe you could share a little bit, and you've alluded to this, but a little bit about your research and practice.
Sure. So I'm doing some interesting research now. I mean, being my practice has been mostly almost from the beginning centered in New Orleans. I mean, I've done some stuff in Baltimore and here in Texas, but in New Orleans, the practice really started to focus a lot pre-Katrina on recovery. And then even before that on environmental justice. So detriments of certain populations because of living certain places in the landscape. And then also how do you mitigate the impacts of that? And then recently I've been doing this research, some academic research, which kind of related to my professional work about Maroons, which were escaped slaves who lived within the wetlands. And then looking at, because I've been really interested in climate change, and then looking at how the way they live can kind of be a model because, they had to live with nature and they needed nature in order to, to sustain themselves, actually to hide in it, So when the wetlands were destroyed and impacted their populations. But anyway, so that's the kind of connections I've been kind of trying to make between, and I think it's pretty evident between the importance of the natural environment for, sustaining life and our health and the planet.
Yeah. I'll share with you that oftentimes at our conference, again, this is in our 19th year, we often have a designer, someone that Andrew White, our landscape architect, refers to as a starchitect. And then we often have someone who brings kind of a community voice. And I find, and I think people will see this in your keynote, you actually marry those two in different ways, where it seems to me like your role as a designer of public spaces is also serving as a conduit for the community. And I'm curious if you could comment about how you deal with the challenges and conflicts that role can present.
Well, actually, for me, most successful design spaces are those that incorporate the community from the beginning, right? Because as designers, you're not going to be the one that eventually uses the space or shapes it to its end. So if you can bring the users, and I say this no matter what kind of design you're doing, if you're doing a high corporate plaza to a community garden to, a reclamation project, a community open space, whoever the users are need to be a part of that, because they become the stewards, right? They become the ones that are going to make the project live or die. So it's really important to have participation and engagement throughout. And I've had projects, where the client wasn't a public client, and having to convince them that you need to do some engagement. And once I could you can actually put that in dollars. You can say, okay, your maintenance costs will be less. Your project will live on longer. You'll have less headaches because the community will embrace it. Or to public projects where they often demand that you do that. And often I've been in projects where someone else did the engagement, it was passed on to me, or where I was doing the engagement and it was passed on to a designer. So I just think, at least that's just my opinion and my experience, that those things have to marry. Like you have to, whoever the users are going to be, then they have to be a part of the design process, or at least some of the programming or the thinking in some way. Because as a designer, you're going to leave and go on to the next thing, and you want your design to live on, and it's going to be in their hands.
Yeah, you're reminding me of Carlos Perez, who's involved in the Activate ATL effort, likes to say that when you bring the community in early, they can be an ally. You bring them in late, and they're a critic. And I think that, again, there's kind of we can do this one of two ways kind of element that I think that this really tees up. And you're whetting my appetite to kind of get into some of your case studies that will be jumping into your keynote. Before we jump into that keynote, anything you want to provide in terms of setting the stage or context before we jump into things?
Yeah, so I was looking at looking at the theme for your conference. I was trying to look at parks at different scales, right? Different scales of the city to a small. Actually, I go down to the lot scale, and then neighborhood, city scale, and then also I always try to look at everything in the paradigm of sustainability. And for that, I feel like there are like three pieces to that pie. Economic, cultural, and then environmental. And I think sustainability doesn't work without any of those. It has to have all three of those pieces. You have to think of the economic component. You have to think of the social cultural, which is the community and users. And of course, you have to think of the environmental impacts. So the case studies are kind of divided up in those kind of paradigms.
Excellent. Well, with that, let's jump into your keynote presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. And after we all view your keynote, then we'll come back here to answer some questions from the audience. And audience members, if you'll please put your questions in the chat, we'll pull those into the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diane Jones-Allen, landscape architect, and I'm really excited about being here with you today at the Parks and Greenspace Conference. And I'm going to be talking to you about creating sustainable communities. I'll be looking at 3 different projects at various scales. And I want to, thank Parks and Greenspace for inviting me. So the 3 projects I'm going to look at are at various scales: the city scale, the neighborhood scale, and then all the way down to the residential lot scale. And each of these projects incorporate sustainability. And I look at sustainability through this, the kind of 3-prong model of social, cultural, economic, and environmental. And I think these are intertwined, and that you have to look at sustainability in this holistic way. I also want to invite you, if you can go to the chat, and if you have a different model of sustainability, or if you have any opinion on the pros and cons of looking at sustainability this way, that would be really great if you could let me know about that. and maybe after the talk, we can have a discussion. So the first project is the Claiborne Cultural Innovation District. This project, we at DesignJones, the firm which I'm a principal of, we worked on it with Myers Engineer, and this project was in New Orleans. And it was basically a project that's kind of at the city scale, in that this corridor is a main corridor through New Orleans. And as you can see from the slide, in the 70s, pre the 70s, before the freeway was dropped, it was one of the longest stands of oak trees in North America, actually, Claiborne Avenue. And it was basically a linear park that kind of knitted together this very affluent to middle class African American community. And then below, you can see what happened after the freeway was dropped. Okay. So in this process, we were working, we came in after another team had done the engagement. And this team, Colligate, which did the engagement process. And you can see the schedule that's on this slide. And I actually was part of one of these engagements because this is a community that I had lived in previously and I was very active in as a citizen. So I participated on a panel. This engagement process was really important, and it left us with kind of a guide to go through, the community design report. So that's really important when you're doing sustainability, to have input and engagement from the community that feeds into the design. Okay, and out of this engagement came these community tenants. This freeway is still there, and there was a study earlier to take it down, but it was found that the community didn't want it down because they thought when the freeway came down that the whole neighborhood would gentrify, they'd be displaced. And you could see that they use it. They use this open space. So it's like, how do you leave the freeway? I mean, it eventually may come down, but build upon the human capital and build upon what people are already doing and reinforce their claiming of the open space. And some of these, tenants, or some of the things that we want to focus on was entrepreneurship, because you could see there was like a market, that informal marketplace people had set up under there, and then youth activities. Creating green space and green infrastructure and recreation. And this space had a history of there was a canal underneath. So water, which is definitely a part of New Orleans, and green, which is definitely a part of New Orleans, and how this history is layered, how the environment is layered, was really important to us. And then connecting to what kind of design language would we use? So connecting to the history and also the present. And New Orleans, which is definitely a gumbo and has a layered history of many different cultures: Spanish, Moorish, even the African, Moroccan, and Moorish culture was really important. And then, looking at, okay, so how do we articulate these into kind of design concepts? But the thing here was not to over-design because people were already using it, but to use the design to reinforce. So we did a master plan where we split this, it was 19 blocks into these different kind of conceptual design and programming areas. A Garden of the Moors, which was really heavy into water collection and green infrastructure, a back of town plaza where there would be a marketplace, also in Spirit Circle, a marketplace, and then Tambourine and Fan, which would be for young people, and a really active area. because this is a place where people second line already and gather at Mardi Gras. And so here are just some of the detailed designs. We'll go through this really quickly. The last one was showing like the water collection, the marketplace. And there's a lot of water that comes down off of the freeway. So there was a great opportunity to build cisterns and collect this water. And then the informal market. So this was, you know, definitely that paradigm of how do you have environmental, you know, sustainability? How do you have economics? Economics is really important. And how do you bring in the culture? So that, you know, pie paradigm of sustainability really shaped this project, like literally in a really strong way. And so then we actually, when we finished the plan, there was a lot of engagement, even after the first team had done the engagement. Following their guide, we continued to have engagement. So we actually brought the plan out into the space, you know, to see how it really, you know, did we really hit the mark to get people's response before, this is way before construction documents. Do we make sure we protected what was happening? Because all you see is happening is pre the design. So the design really had to protect that. And so it's really great to like bring it out there on the site. Okay, and so the next project is about connecting to culture and history also. And this was Martin Luther King Memorial Walk, and it was kind of a contested space, which, as you can see on the slide, had a really long history. And as most sites in New Orleans, there was a canal that was buried underneath the site, the Malpomene Canal, that actually went from Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi River. That's the blue line that you see. And this is the site. The site was that kind of the little pilot piece, the beginning of this neutral ground, which is a median in New Orleans. We call it a neutral ground, which lies right over the Malpomene Canal and at the intersection of O.C. Haley and Martin Luther King. And a really important intersection because post-Katrina, a lot of redevelopment happened there. And the key, you know, is understanding the history of a place, how it evolved, especially urban neighborhoods, which have really strong histories, and how this, you know, there's always the question of who is the community, who lives there. And the community here had been very diverse. There were German, Italian, you know, shop owners and African Americans who, you know, inhabited the place, musicians who played, you know, in the venues. And then the community evolved, and this is also more about the history that, like I said, there were African American insurance companies and doctors and German bakers and Jewish merchants. So it was very integrated and vibrant. But then things changed. Things were segregated. Right here. And O.C. Haley was part of the civil rights movement to like help to desegregate. It's interesting because, you know, it was a once very multicultural place, got desegregated. And then through, you know, a lot of strong activism, you know, civic activism, the place was desegregated. Then comes along now gentrification or redevelopment, let's put it that way. So redevelopment comes, and so there are new residents and new tourists, and property values start to raise. A big, this slide shows part of a big improvement, capital improvement project. which often comes in, the city will come in where they kind of know developers are coming. And then that increases development because, developers say, okay, there's capital investment. So that's what happened here. And as you can see, there a lot of new development, and how do you make it inclusive was one of the big issues there. More development. And this Jane Jacob Walk is activity that the new residents have been doing, where they walk through. And the development actually has been nice. There's been shops and businesses and a great revitalization of old structures. But there's still like this as I call it, contested space thing kind of happening with new residents and people that have been the surrounding residential area, people who have been there a long time. Who kind of use the space in a different way. They use the space for like memorial and marches and protests. So it's the problem. The issue became, so how do you satisfy both of these in this public urban park space? How do you satisfy both of these? And so one thing we decided to do was to bring the two groups together. When we got the project, they didn't really have to do community engagement because the project was already improved. It was state money funds and also some private funds from the merchant association, but we convinced them that you must do some engagement. And so we brought people onto the site. And then we kind of had this transactive process where the two groups could talk. And then we tried to understand like the history, because this is beneath the site. You can see how it's changed. And it's actually it was wooden, and there's a very beautiful bricked in canal beneath. So also looking, at the site and the existing sculpture, MLK sculpture that was there, but was in disrepair. And then we, after all those engagements on and off the site with both groups together, we came up with a couple of schemes for the park space. And this was the final scheme. And as I said before, this was the tradition, what was happening before there by the surrounding residents. And so we still wanted that to happen. So this was after the project was done. And it even, by transforming the landscape to make it more open so that people could come and relax and do those passive, recreation things, but also make it open to the kind of civic activities that were happening. Yeah, and this was, so the sculpture was restored, and we made this space that, stroll, you could sit, but you could also protest. We made a stage, and we opened it up because New Orleans is definitely about the street, so that it connected to the street. As you can see, the van in the street, and the whole street becomes like connected to this plaza space. Those are just the activity. And then also kind of, it's also a nice place where, like you can see there's I think a celloist up there. So you can have concerts or other things. You have cultural activity, but you could also have civic protests in this space. And that was really important to sustaining the space and keeping the stewards on both sides. And the last project, which gets down to the lot scale, which is important so that people feel connected to the landscape and are part of sustaining it themselves. So this project, the NORCAP project, is another pilot project where the city provided, or people in this particular neighborhood that's outlined in the blue, Gentilly, they could each family could get $25,000 to do stormwater management on their own site. So the challenge here is you want to, this neighborhood flooded after Katrina, you want to, mitigate flooding again, because we have storms every year. So you also want to give residents kind of power and understanding of these issues. And the one great way to do it is have them have control on their own site. And then, we kind of look at all those sites and put them together, and then we can kind of figure out how much water we can collect in the whole neighborhood. But this was like a really great project. It's still ongoing because there are, about 400 residents that signed up, or 400 families. So this is the site. As you can see, it's full of water, surrounded by water. And we had a big meeting and engagement process. There are two teams, one headed by Dana Brown, landscape architecture firm, who's doing some of the lots, working with residents, and DesignJones is another team working on some. And so this is when residents came to hear about it and to sign up. And this is like kind of an information session where we're, talking to residents about, stormwater management and, the importance of, having this on their lot. And, and it was difficult because, some people want azaleas and not bioswales, but actually a lot of people really wanted to do this, and actually, knew sometimes a lot more than we did, about their own property and where the water flows and those kinds of things. And so we, gave out literature and met with each property owner that signed up, and people could sign up for either firm on their own. They got to pick who they wanted. And so we put this together to give them some idea of the kind of things that could happen. So we had to do all this, looking at, what's the cost per site, how much water you're going to collect, what kind of system you're going to put in. And we did this, working with each individual owner and having them design with them. So this just to give you an example of, what this one actually has a lot of green space. A lot of them, there's paving everywhere. So, but Gentilly actually was one of the first African-American suburbs. So almost all the people own their own property, which was a requirement for this, but that wasn't unusual in Gentilly. Okay. So this gives you kind of some before, a lot of broken up concrete. And so people wanted their patios and they wanted their driveways. So using permeable paving and using crushed granite, things to kind of absorb the water, but still give them, they're the kind of outdoor spaces that they wanted. This is another one. And so this shows before. And so we came back with permeable pavers. We have dry creeks, a lot of crushed stone, because they wanted these paved areas, but getting them to realize that, okay, you can have all this paving, but you need to collect the water. And it'll actually, be a lot usable, and you can still do all the things you want to do. And they really embraced it, which was great. And then also, as you can see, this one isn't quite finished. The planting hasn't been put in. We put in a lot of plants and getting them to, use natives and plants that are really good for collecting water. And in Louisiana, we have a lot of those because there's a lot of water and wetlands. So, but getting them to say, okay, I don't have to have camellias and azaleas. Maybe I can have Louisiana irises and other things that are good for collecting water. Let's see. So we'll just go through this. And this is another one where you could see so besides the permeable paving, we did a lot of bioswales, took up a lot of grass, which was another thing to convince them. And then they were happy because they realized, oh, I don't have to mow. I'm like, yes, you're being green. You don't have to mow. And one of the big things is we provided them with a manual so they can know how much water they collected, how much pervious space was reduced, and what to do. How do they take care of it? So it's really great. And then when other people saw this, they want it. They wanted, you know, these facilities on their property. So the more we would do them, the more people would sign up for them. Anyway, so those are 3 different scales of, you know, how in an urban area you can look at sustainability, which, you know, in my paradigm means you have to connect to the people that use the space. You have to let them drive the design. You have to have an exchange of knowledge, you know, using your expertise. Our expertise as designers is really important. And so is the knowledge base of the community, so that they will be stewards of it. And that's why things get sustained. So you know, if you have questions, we will talk. Hopefully we can. And then if you, you know, wanted to put anything in the chat box, that's great. So I want to thank you. And I look forward to talking to you after this.
Excellent. Well, I have been watching the questions coming in the chat, and I see my job is trying to tee these up as quickly as we can so we can get to some of the questions, because you have certainly resonated with our audience. I think folks are very excited about having a designer who is really oriented towards and engaged on the idea of getting the community involved early and often. So let's jump right into this. And the first question that I'll put out there is, do you have examples of best practices of how engagement with community was approached, looking at a variety of barriers, including internet access and virtual events, transportation for in-person, or building trust, particularly for the homeless community who may be inhabiting this space? I think that might also be referencing some of the overpass example that came up. And I think there was a question I saw that was also asking with the example of keeping the freeway, whether or not there were any issues with homeless that might have used that area or something along those lines.
Great questions. And so even, you know, now post-COVID, or if we're not post-COVID, but post the beginning of COVID, or now that we're in this, and we're still, you know, we're working on projects. And the thing about internet access and how you do engagement when you can't have large groups of people in a room is really important. We've actually done some of those where we actually had, we've done this in Dallas, in a community in South Dallas called Joppy. And so we use a community center and a library where people could social distance and provide laptops, and people could come. Or if you were at home, you could, so that those that didn't have it could come and social distance and wear a mask and use a public laptop. We did those. But before COVID, that's really important, because when you have these big charrettes, which is pretty typical, you leave a lot of people out. A lot of people can't come at, you know, 5 o'clock or 6 to 10 because they have kids. They might work in the evening. You know, a lot of people don't have like 9 to 5 like some of us. They work at night. And so how do you get everybody's voice? And I find that you have to do smaller engagements and go out into the community, right? So, you know, we did things where, you know, we went to the barber shop, or we went to a park in a community and people could come. You know, you find out the local church and you go. So you have to kind of go where they are and the places they go. And you have to vary the times, we did things on Saturday mornings, believe it or not. Certain people would come as opposed to in the evening when they needed to get their kids' homework or go off to work or something. So you have to kind of meet the community where you are, because I think engagement has always been, we pick a place, we have a charrette, we have something, and the community comes to us. But if you're really going to have transactive engagement, you have to go to the community where they are and use the techniques, especially now, but even before now, that is going to be most accessible. And in terms of the homeless, that's a really good issue, because we also were working on another project, Charity Innovation District, which actually looked at that same freeway overpass. And we, you know, tried to get the city, the client, and in this project too, in the innovation district, to realize that those are informal settlements, right? It's kind of new thinking. But it's like in other countries, they've been doing that for a long time. Favelas and, like, okay, let's put the infrastructure there, because we find that people don't want, when you try to have homeless apartments or housing built in certain neighborhoods, people don't want them. But it's about rethinking the homeless, giving them respect and realizing that they're trying to adapt to life where they are. So we would actually go to them and then trying to get the client to rethink and respect, especially in New Orleans there. And if you go there, and I guess some of the people that I'm talking to have, before you wouldn't see that many homeless, but now underneath those freeways, yes, they have made informal settlements and rethinking how do you deal with those, and that they do need to have a voice. So actually in this project, we actually went there to them and, we brought food and we talked to them, and we actually invited them. We brought flyers and invited them to come to some of the meetings. And some of them did. And then when that happened first, and then when we did that and we didn't have a lot come, we actually went to them. We brought food and came to them just to get their understanding of, did they look at where they were living as informal settlements or how. So I really do think that they have to be a part of it, and they have to be respected as another part of the community.
Yeah. And I think that part of what you're talking about with rethinking our approach actually brings me to my next question, that is more looking at the landscape architecture field. And in your role educating the next generation of landscape architects, have you noticed growing diversification in the field? My hope is that the landscape architecture profession is attracting a more diverse talent pool, and curious just to see your experience both in your academic role as well as just your efforts within the field.
Yes, this is so exciting because this change is actually coming from the students. The students are more diverse in terms of where they come from, their economics. Landscape architecture for a long time had been kind of a white male field, and then it became a lot of white women. But now it's like really diverse. There are more people of color, there are international students that come. I'm in Texas. We have Latina students, so it's very diverse. And because of that, and this is all of them. I mean, even the young white male students are demanding not only diversity in, who practices, but diversity in how we practice and diversity in the curriculum. Because of this push, there's been a group called ASLA Adapt, a group of young people, and mostly majority young people, if you want to use that term majority. They've gone and they've pushed ASLA so that the lab requirements are now for accreditation are going to change to make sure curriculum has to include what they call JEDI, Justice, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. And they have also pushed that we have to have climate change. And this came from the students, didn't come from us old heads or, young professors. It came from the students that are coming in saying, these are the things that are important. And the thing about that, this came from students, no matter what their, you could look at it, no matter what their race or culture were, they all want this kind of diversity in the education, and they want the curriculum of landscape architecture to change to make sure that they are equipped to address these things when they get out into the world. So I'm so proud of the students and the changes that I see in landscape architecture, but it's coming from the bottom up, which is great.
Yeah. What was the group's name that you mentioned? I didn't catch that.
It's called ASLA Adapt, ADAPT. You can look them up, and they're a bunch of young, there are students and people that are just out of school that put like a manifesto together first on climate change, and then they just did one for JEDI, and they have been responsible for making ASLA and lab change.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to there's another question that was from Alyssa, and this related to one of your projects that you highlighted. Other than preserving physical elements, the existing sculpture, and I think this might have been the MLK example, how were you able to pay homage to the diverse culture and history of the local community? You mentioned the various blocks. Can you speak more of your thinking here? Were you able to connect with local artists?
In the middle of the plaza, there's a round circle, and with the Arts Council, there's going to be a mural put on that circle. That hasn't happened yet. It's going through an Arts Council process. But actually, we did that because we did connect with artists. And then also, there are engravings on those big stones that go along. But one thing that we did is we tried to make space for artists and cultural activity to happen, right? So making like, just because that before it was full of like shrubs and paving planting that kind of took up the middle. It was very enclosed. So we opened it up so that you could see, that you could have music concert, because music's really important. So that music could happen there, and that social gatherings could happen there, or art exhibits, or a craft fair. So we tried to create a space for those kind of artistic things to happen. And we actually had artists involved. We worked really closely with the Ashe Cultural Center, which is across on O.C. Haley. We worked with a jazz market, which is also across. So yeah, that was a good question, because that was really important, because that's kind of a part of New Orleans life, and it's more about making places for those things to happen, right?
Right. And thinking broadly about art, so it's not just the physical representation, but looking at music and other different elements. So I think that's very helpful. We have time for one last question. It comes from good friend Daryl Haddock with the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. He writes, relating to canals, how were the design nods to open canals received? Were the water features received as positive? Water, especially open canals, were essentially open sewers in many cities. Was this design element considered negative?
That's a good question too, because the canal that's under Claiborne Corridor, there had been a design, because there was an earlier project that I mentioned too that looked at taking down the freeway, and one of the proposals was to open that up into a canal. And the community, especially on one side, because one side of that Claiborne Corridor has kind of gentrified Treme, the other side hasn't, and still very African American, very diverse. So there was uproar about not only taking the freeway down, but uproar about putting a canal in there. And the uproar was not just because, yes, it looked, open sewer or dangerous. The uproar was that you can't second line in the middle of a canal. You can't have a barbecue in the middle of a canal. You can't stand there, on that canal is where the Zulu parade comes on Mardi Gras. So you can't stand in the middle of canal and wait for your Mardi Gras parade. So it was that opening that up would take away the space that they use, because that canal sits right under that space. And if you took the freeway down and made that a canal again, you can't do the civic cultural things that they do in New Orleans in the middle of a canal. And that's why you haven't seen so many of them daylighted, because the neutral grounds in New Orleans are the center of life. People, they're like linear parks. They're where the second lines happen. The Mardi Gras Indians come, the informal markets happen. And so if you turn those into canals, there goes, civic life. So that was the real reasons. And the consultant who was from outside was kind of shocked. They were like, why wouldn't people want this horrible freeway down? And it was because they were worried about then the usurping of the culture, because of the new proposal of putting beautiful boulevards and lovely canals, but you can't second line on that. So that's why.
Right. And kind of who is that space for, that if the highway goes away, maybe we go too. So
yes.
All the time in terms of Q&A. Diane, it's been a real pleasure to be here with you today, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us answering some questions.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me. This has been really great.